Last week we talked about buy and hold, and this week we were going to talk about property managers. What the hell's going on here? We're going to talk about property managers.
To be clear, is mass mail-in ballot, where they basically say,
Sorry.
And one of the reasons we talk about property managers is because a lot of us don't have it in us. It's not that we can't manage our own properties. For a lot of people, the question is, should you manage your own property? And for a lot of us, the answer is clearly no. We shouldn't be managing our own properties. We have no business even trying to be a landlord as a manager. Most people that try to manage their own properties aren't tough enough to deal with the tenants, and they're not mean enough. I hate to say it that way, but that's blunt. They're not mean enough to make the tenants abide by the rules. And unfortunately, when you're trying to be a landlord, either you teach your tenants to act the way you want them to, or your tenants teach you to act the way they want you to. There's no middle ground. And what you need to remember is when you're learning to be a landlord, the tenants already know how to be a tenant. And if they don't, there's lots of people that can tell them how to be a tenant. One of the problems with being a landlord is dealing with tenants and tenant phone calls. But you know, the tenants really fall into three different categories, actually four categories, but three of them that concern me. There's the needy tenant, the independent tenant, and the troublesome or the problem makers. And then there's the good tenant. We don't need to talk much about good tenants, right? They're the easy ones to manage. They're the hardest ones to find, the easiest ones to manage. What's a needy tenant? A needy tenant calls you for absolutely everything. Whether it's related to their being in your rental or not, they call you. If they get in a car accident, they call you and complain. Their car engine blows up, they call you and complain. They call you all the time. They always have something that they need, and they always need to talk to you. It's kind of like you're their mom or dad. Unfortunately, I generally find the needy tenants fall into two categories. They're really young or they're really old. Not so much in the middle. The troublesome tenant, most of us know what that looks like. That's somebody that just causes you no end of pain and suffering. But not enough is spent on the independent tenant. The independent tenant, some people think is good because the independent tenant doesn't call you very much and they tend to take care of stuff themselves. But the problem is the stuff that they're taking care of themselves isn't always done to your standards for your house. So if something breaks, they might repair it with duct tape. The plumbing leaks, wrap it in duct tape. If duct tape didn't work, put a plastic bag over it. You get a hole in the drywall. You take a cardboard box and you put it over the hole and put mastic on it, and suddenly the hole is fixed, no problem. The independent tenant is one of those that they fix things, which sometimes isn't a bad thing, but they fix them without your knowledge, and you don't find out what they've done until you do your inspections or until they move out. I mean, I've seen it where they've screwed shelves inside of cabinets with screws through the sidewall of the cabinet on the exposed side. I've seen them fix windows with plexiglass instead of glass. Now, I do that sometimes too, but not in a double-paned house. All three of those tenant types make life a little hard for a landlord. Add in the fact that what do you do if a tenant brings in a pest? What if you're in a multifamily and you're in Arizona and a tenant moves in and they buy a used couch that has bed bugs in it? And you've got a fourplex. How many tenants are you going to be putting up in a motel so you can fix the bed bug problem? 4, or whatever the number is in the unit. Pests cause a lot of issues. The tenant doesn't tell you about the pests right away. The tenant that moved in with the used couch isn't going to tell you about them. It's going to be one of the other tenants. And dealing with those issues become somewhat of a nightmare if they're not single family. Single family homes a little easier. Even though the tenant causes the problem in a single family home, do you still have to provide them alternate housing while you take care of it? According to the State Landlord Tenant Act as it was revised in 2008, yes. The revision in 2012 didn't give you any other break. One of the other things that becomes kind of problematic in this world of landlording is insurance claims. You actually know if you get too many insurance claims on your rentals, the insurance companies don't want to rent to you. If you don't know a way to fix damages without making an insurance claim, unless it's one that really needs to be made, then you need somebody that knows how to get those fixed cheaply. I'm not saying the repair done at a substandard level. I'm saying the repair done at the not going plumber's rate. For example, you don't use a plumber like George Brazil on your rental houses. You can't afford $425 an hour. And that's what they want to charge for an emergency call out. You need to know somebody that can be called out and is going to charge you a reasonable rate. It may still be $100 an hour, but compared to $425, that's reasonable. The other thing with insurance is, as a new landlord, who do you have insure your house? If you've never been a landlord before, what insurance company is better for insuring your house and what insurance companies are worse? And if you go to somebody like Farmers, Farmers is a great insurance company, but as a landlord, they're not going to insure your house through the Farmers primary company, which is the great insurance company. They're going to insure it through Foremost or one of the sub companies, which may not be a great insurance company. But if you're a new landlord, you don't know that. Your property manager might and should. We talked about contractors. Property managers, I'm going to split my screen here. You should be seeing a picture, the 5 responsibilities of property managers.
We see it.
This is kind of a good graphics of what a property manager should do. They should be setting the rent. The reason you use the property manager to set the rent and not you is because the property manager should know what market rent is. I know you think you know what rent was when you bought it, but having been a property manager for many years, I find most inexperienced landlords don't really know what the going rent rate is in the area. And a lot of them have an idea that it's a little higher than it really is. Now, you can charge a rent premium, but the problem in today's world is if you charge a rent premium and it looks like the rent premium is to not attract certain tenants, that's considered discrimination. Who decides if the rent premium is to not attract certain tenants? Not you, not me, not the manager, the judge. And we don't want to go there. Especially today, the number one cause of concern in being a landlord is fair housing. Fair housing deals with discrimination. You must understand the Fair Housing Act and how it's applied if you're going to be a landlord. And not enough people do. Not enough real estate agents do. To be truthful, Even not enough lawyers do. But then a lawyer's job is to throw shit on the wall and hope something falls down that he gets paid for. So it doesn't matter if he doesn't, because he has no cost if he does it wrong. But you as a landlord might. The property manager should collect your rent. I'm going to come back on that one. See the top box? The property manager screens your tenants. We used to always get into an argument with our owners because they would want to screen the tenants. That's fine, you can. But if you screen the tenants, then you must have all your own resources to do it, not mine. If we're using my resources to do it, I'm governed by overseeing those resources. All I can do is tell you whether the tenant qualifies or does not qualify and give you the choice. If I got 2 qualifying tenants, I can give you the choice of which one you want. And I can give you a plus and minus on their qualification differences, but I really can't tell you what their credit score is. I really can't tell you anything of their financial history. That's all considered protected information under fair credit. And that can get me in a lot of trouble. Then the property manager is responsible for maintaining your property, and last of all but not least, managing budgets and sending reports. This is kind of a nice little graphic that summarizes everything. Why would you hire a property manager? Probably the big, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dan.
For most people that I know that use a property, they don't want to deal with these issues. They'd rather pay the 10 or 12%.
That's one reason to hire a property manager, because you don't want to be a landlord. You just want to get your income, so you're willing to pay part of your profits for somebody else to deal with the professionalism of the business. And it gives you an independent third party that you can, I hate to say it this way, but we're seeing it happen on TV all the time, from politicians to street raiders to everybody else in the industry. It gives you a third party that you can push off blame on, right?
Yeah.
And to some extent, you can do that. They're supposed to be the professionals. They're the licensed individuals. They should have known better. It may still hurt you a little bit, but not as much as if you did it. But you know, probably one of the best reasons to hire a property manager, besides that, is you're not close to your property. If you're not somewhere you can drive by your property every other month or so, at least once a quarter, then you probably should hire a property manager. What about if you don't have time to manage your property? The thing to remember is when you're doing property management or you're being a landlord, timeliness is key. When a tenant calls and complains, you need to resolve that complaint right now. That doesn't mean you need to fix everything. If it's the tenant's problem that it's broken, somebody needs to tell the tenant it's their problem that's broken, enact the fix and bill the tenant. But you need to do all that right now. The longer you wait, the worse tenant relationship you create and the more danger you put your property in. In some cities, not so much in Arizona, but even in Arizona, for example, Mesa, if the tenant isn't getting their repairs done and they call the city of Mesa and complain, Mesa sends out the slum landlord division to visit you. And if you don't fix the complaints for the tenant in what Mesa considers a timely manner, they pull your habitation certificate, which means your house cannot be rented again until you get it back. Now, Mesa's not the only city in Arizona that does it, but in Phoenix, it is the only city doing it. So it's important that you respond in a timely manner. So do you have time? Will you make the time? One of my favorites to point out is some of you just aren't tough enough to deal with tenants. Dealing with tenants is like dealing with a kindergartner. Every time you say no, they're going to ask again in a different way. The only difference is the kindergarten are small enough that you've all seen that little video on the internet where they're working from home. They got the kid taped to the floor. The kindergarten are small enough you can tape them to the floor and get them to be quiet. The tenant's not that little. He can break the tape and get away. So unless you're really used to being tough and making your point known and making your point stick, whatever, making your point always be the major point, you shouldn't be a landlord. You should just be an investor that owns a rental property and has somebody else managing it. And it's really important, if you're going to deal with tenants, you have to be tough. I used to say, if you can't win an argument against your wife, you shouldn't be a landlord. The problem is I lose 90% of them, so I'm not a very good example on how to win an argument with my wife. But men, that attitude we have that sooner or later we just say, okay, whatever you want is what we'll do. That's not the way you want to deal with tenants. And you have to remember that. If you can't say no and mean it and stick to it, then you shouldn't be a landlord. You should be an investor with rental properties managed by somebody else. With that said, the next question is, what should the property manager do to you? We've already described some of that. But if you're going to look for a property manager, there's a few questions you want to ask the property management company. Number one question I always like to know is, how experienced are they? Now understand, property management companies generally come in 3 different styles. And not all of them are good for what you want. They need to match what your property is going to be. I don't often talk about this, but tonight I will. We have the commercial property managers. They manage commercial properties. They have no business ever managing a landlord relationship. They're not used to that game. The rules are 100% different. For example, they can give a tenant a notice and show up that night and lock the doors with all the tenant stuff inside the commercial building. And if the tenant doesn't pay their rent, they can sell all that commercial stuff at auction to recover their cost. If you were to try that with the personal stuff of a tenant in a residential landlord situation, not only would you get sued, but you would probably owe the tenant the original charges for what he lost. So if he had $1,000 in goods that you auctioned off, you'd owe him the $1,000 plus 3 times that amount. So you'd end up owing the tenant $4,000, triple damages, or what they commonly call treble damages. So I want to know what experience they have. A management company that's really good at managing multifamily probably isn't that great at managing single family. It's been my experience that they actually suck at it. A single family property management company sucks at managing multifamilies. They're not used to having all the ants in the same column. They're used to having them spread out. When you're managing multifamily properties, you get one bad tenant, you've got to quickly resolve that bad tenant issue before you have all your tenants bad within the dwelling. When you're managing single family, you get one bad tenant, you're just dealing with one bad situation and you have time. And there's a difference in environment and a difference in attitude. There's a difference in repairs. I mean, if you got a 2-story apartment complex and there's a water leak, even though the water leak isn't health and safety and technically you have 30 days to repair it, in a 2-story apartment building, if it's the 2nd story, it's health and safety right frickin' now. And it's got to be worked on. In a single family home, if the plumber can't get there for 4 or 5 hours, who cares? Other than the damage to the home. But in the multifamily, you got damage to 2 units now or more. So there's 3 types of managers. So when I'm asking for experience, I want them to have experience in what I want them to manage for me. If I'm managing single family homes and that's what my rentals are, then I want them to have single family home experience. And I want them to have significant experience, let's say. Now, some of the property managers got a break recently because there's a lot of property management companies that came around in 2014, 15 that are out there now advertising for business, and they were never around when times were tough. I mean, think about it. Since 2012, there's been an abundance of tenants. Finding tenants is not much harder than finding buyers on listings today. But back in 2005, 6, 7, when everybody was moving into homes, finding tenants was tough. Today, finding tenants that didn't get evicted for not paying their rent or didn't escape from paying their rent during the COVID fiasco, whether they should have or not, has given some of these property managers some new experience. And in a lot of ways, some of these new property managers haven't survived that experience very well. They should have, but they didn't. Next question I want to know after experience, and experience generally for me, I want more than 5 years. That's just my rule of thumb. I find if they've got less than 5 years experience, they probably don't know what the hell they're doing. Second thing I find is I want to know if they're licensed, and I want to know what certifications they have. There are certifications for property managers, but in just about every state, they need to be licensed real estate brokerages. They may or may not do traditional real estate. In fact, I would prefer they don't. I would prefer their core business was on property management, and the real estate brokerage business they did was just extra. But they need to be licensed individuals. In Arizona, it's really simple. If you're not licensed, you can represent one property per day. To do any more than that, that includes marketing them in the media or on any other source, you've got to be a licensed real estate agent working for a licensed brokerage. Now, I will take a property manager that works for a brokerage when the brokerage is not the property management, but that property manager has to be a professional manager only managing properties. So, for example, my brokerage, if we were to bring in a property management company, we would still be a real estate brokerage, but the property management company would be under the brokerage label, but they would only do property management. The people doing property management wouldn't do anything else. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for professional managers. So when I say I'm looking for professional managers, you know, one of the first things that should come to mind is, do they look professional? I was in Texas and I had a management company that came highly recommended from a group of investors. And they said this guy was a really good property manager. When he showed up to meet me, he was in a 86 or 87 Pontiac 6000. And it looked like a 1986, 87 Pontiac 6000. And it smoked like one. He was in jeans, and I don't have a problem with jeans. Lord knows I wear them a lot. He was in jeans and a t-shirt, and he had paint on them. I don't care what your definition of professional is, he's not it. What we found out later through the other parties that were using him is he was really good at doing repairs and rehabbing your properties, but he really sucked as a property manager. And what a lot of the people that actually used them and the people that recommended them to me, I never hired them. What they found out is they were being overbilled. So instead of spending 2 hours for a plumbing repair, they were being billed for 4 hours. Where does the extra 2 hours go? Property manager. When a guy shows up and it doesn't look like he's got much, it's hard to believe he's a professional property manager. They ought to look like they're professional. I don't really care what car they drive. I don't care if they're driving a truck. But it sure shouldn't be, in 2008, it shouldn't be a 1986 Pontiac 6000. Maybe a 1996 Pontiac 6000. I guess I'd have to see that car at that time and make that decision. But they ought to look and act professional. If they don't look and act professional when they meet you, they're not looking and acting professional when they meet your clients or anybody else. And if people don't look and act professional when they're meeting you, you have to assume that they don't act that way ever. And if they don't act that way ever, why are you hiring them? That's exactly not what you want. Next thing I want to know is how big their management portfolio is. And this is kind of a tough question that we ask. When we ask how big the management portfolio is, it's not because we're looking for a small management company. It's not because we're looking for a big management company. It's because we're trying to rate how much resources they have to apply to management of my property. If they're a small company and they have 25, 30 properties under management, and there's just the manager managing them, he can handle a few more properties. But it's been my experience that 25 to 30 properties, single family properties, is about what a manager can handle. They can collect rent from a lot more, but dealing with all the other issues gets to be a little tough. Definitely when you get over 50, the manager's not handling them worth a darn. So once they tell you how big they are, then you can also ask how much staff they have. How many managers are on staff? And one of the questions I always ask is, do you have your own maintenance people or do you hire outside resources? If they're your own, is there an overhead charge on them or is it a blanket charge? A blanket charge means they charge me an hourly rate and that's it, whatever the maintenance company charges. An overhead charge means they charge me 10% or more on top of it. They should not be charging me an overhead charge if they're not doing a full rehab on my property. If they've got a plumbing leak in the kitchen sink faucet, it ought to be just the charge for the repair people to go out there, nothing else. All right? One of the questions I always like to ask is, how long does it take to fill their tenancy? In other words, what's the vacancy and how long does it take? I want to know the vacancy rate. That tells me what their turnover on tenants is. And then I want to know how long it takes to find an average new tenant. And here's something I learned the hard way. A company that's really good at finding new tenants for your property, but has a pretty high vacancy rate, is probably rolling tenants. So Todd didn't pay Dan, so they evict Todd, but they move him into Tanya's property now. And when he doesn't pay Tanya in 2 months, then they move him out into Janie's property. So it looks like they have a low vacancy rate, but they have a high turnover rate. One without the other doesn't tell you enough. You need to know what both numbers are. And then you want some referrals. You want some referrals from people that, I always ask, I'd like some referrals from people that are happy with your service and currently using it. And I'd like some referrals of the last 3 people that left your company, the last 3 landlords that are no longer with you. Because I want to know why they're not with them. Now, just because they left doesn't necessarily mean they're negative. There's lots of reasons people leave. Number one, they sell out their properties. But the people that are with them now, they're going to give me the people, when I ask for the people that are still there, they're going to give me the people that are most happy with them, which may also be the newest people with them. When I interview those, I will call all those people. And when I interview the people, I ask how long they were with the management company. The people that left the management company, I always ask them if the manager changed and that's the reason they left. Because the problem with property management companies is you can have a great company and then a new manager comes in and they're not a great company anymore. Or they could be a better company. But whenever a new manager comes in, that's a danger sign that you got to be careful and watch what you're looking for. I want to know when they pay my monthly distributions and how. Today, almost all of them use some sort of software, and I'll come back to the software at the end. The software does a direct deposit. A lot of management companies charge you to write checks today. I don't care if they do a direct deposit, that's irrelevant to me. I like the direct deposit better because I see it immediately. But the fact is, they shouldn't be holding my money for much more than 3 to 5 days after they get paid. A lot of management companies claim they need to hold your money for 10 days. In today's ACH clearinghouse at the banks, within 10 days, they know if that check is bounced or not. But the truth is, they already know that in 5 days also. If they're taking checks in 5 days, the check would have bounced the first time. The 10 days is because the check gets automatically resubmitted for another 5 days and bounces again. So when you have a check that bounces and somebody tells you about it, it's actually bounced twice. It automatically got resubmitted and they still didn't have enough money. If they're taking checks, I'll take 5 days. I won't take 10 days. There's no reason they should be sitting there making interest on my money. I want my money deposited in my account 3 to 5 days after they've collected it. One of my biggest questions and my biggest concerns with experience is I want to know when they send out their reports. And I want to see a report to know what's in it. A monthly report should have 2 components to it. It should have the financial component showing what they got for rent and what the charges against the rent are. And it should have the forward-looking component that shows me what maintenance needs to be done or what expenses they're expecting to come up. And I want to see that every month. When I get my deposit, I should see that at the same time. Today, a lot of companies actually, you can log into the portal and see it when it's ready. If they're using AppFolio, for example, which is probably one of the more expensive versions of property management software, but in my opinion, one of the best. If they're using AppFolio, every owner has a portal and they can log on the portal and see everything going on with their property at any given time, including the monthly report, the monthly financial report. That's great. AppFolio is even nicer because it can downfeed a comma delineated file that can go right into my QuickBooks and I don't need to copy it in. And being lazy like I am, I don't like copying the numbers in anyway, so I want it all done together. But I want to know when they're sending my reports, and they better be sending reports. If they're not sending reports, I won't even continue talking to them. I already said I want to know if they have an in-house maintenance crew or if they use outside vendor networks. If they use outside vendor networks, I want examples of the plumber, the handyman, and the contractor. And then I want to get referrals from each one of those individuals so I can see what they charge. And preferably I want other landlords. Because, well, I'm in Arizona, and plumbing to me here means that it ought to be $40 an hour. I know when I'm in Texas, it's higher than that. When I'm in Illinois, it's higher yet. I want to have an idea what I'm going to spend for costs. I want to have an idea where they get their parts. One of the other things I want to know is I want to know if they have trucks that do the maintenance, if it's their own people. If they have trucks that do the maintenance, do they carry most of the parts on the truck? And if they carry the parts on the truck, what's the flat service to take them off the truck? See, there's 2 different schools of thought when there's parts on the truck. There's the replacement cost from Home Depot. But remember, if they're using a 1/2-inch 90-degree elbow, PVC elbow, they didn't buy one at Home Depot. They bought the bag with 100 of them in it, and the bag with 100 of them in it, that one was about a penny. But if they buy it separately, it's $3. So I want to know how they charge me the billing cost on the item. There ought to be a truck cost. A good contractor, a good manager will know that and be able to spout that off too. They're used to hearing it. We're going to talk about their fee structure. We always want to ask that. I'll come back to it. I want to see a property management agreement. Yeah, go ahead.
So even though you ask these questions and they give you the correct answers, when you get into it about 2 or 3 months and you find out that they're not keeping up on the portfolio reports, they come up with this deal where they have to hold money longer, you know, and all these things start occurring. How do you get out of a contract?
Hold on a minute. We're heading right there. Good question.
Okay.
I want to see the property management agreement. Now, a lot of times when you go to a property management course, they tell you to ask them how often the agreement renews. I don't really care about that. Even if the agreement is set up to renew automatically, I can stop that by sending a letter in and saying I disagree or striking that out. What I want to see in the property management agreement is where Todd is going with it. I want to know what the contract terms are for basically 3 things. I want to know what the contract term is for the timeline. How long is the management agreement for? I want to know what the contract term is for cause for breaking the agreement. And I want to know what the breach term is. The breach is when one party or the other doesn't do what the contract says they're supposed to do. And then, of course, in the contract, I want to see that they're doing everything I've asked about. I want to see they're giving monthly reports. I want to see that my payments are due 3 to 5 days after they get it. I want to see things like I don't pay them anything if they don't collect rent. All that, and I'll come back to those terms that I want to see in there. But I don't want to pay them when they're not collecting my rent. I don't want to pay them when they're finding me a new tenant because they're already being paid to find the tenant. If the rental is the rental is vacant, or they haven't collected rent, I don't want to pay them. So all those kinds of terms need to be in the management agreement. Now, to Todd's question, if things don't go well, how do you get out of a management agreement? Number one, obviously, you negotiate with them. But sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. So the question becomes, what's the out clauses in the contract? It's popular now to put 30, 90, 30, pretty much just 30 and 90 days for out clauses. And what that means when you see that is you owe them 1 month or 3 months worth of their management take off that rental to buy out the contract. I don't like those in there. If the management company can't do his job, then we don't need any of those terms in there. I'll give the management company money to buy out the lease, but then the management company owes me for everything they didn't do. Usually the discussion breaks at that point. But a good management company isn't worried about keeping you in a management agreement. It's the cheaper, lesser management companies that seem concerned to keep you in a management agreement because they don't get enough or they get too much turnover. Everybody understand what breach is? Breach is when one party doesn't live up to the terms of the contract. How do you prove a breach if you want to break a contract? You have to keep all your correspondence and everything that you gave them. Now, a property manager that's really crappy is going to try to make everything verbal and give you excuses. Record those calls. He can't say he didn't say it when he's on the recorder. In Arizona, you only need your side to know it's being recorded. You don't need both sides. There's some arguments about if we do that with somebody from Illinois, we're violating Illinois law. But if my rental property's in Arizona, I don't really care what Illinois law says. If I have to, I'll sue the Illinois landlord or the Illinois property manager in Arizona too while I'm at it. All right. Ideally, you want that stuff in writing. We have two easy forms of writing out there, right? Email and text. Remember, text messages are considered written. As long as when you save them, it shows who said what, when, and the whole thing is there. On all our phones these days, I don't know where I laid mine, on all our phones these days, we can take out that message and send it out to a file and save it. So it'll show the complete line of text. That's written correspondence. If you have to prove breach, because that's the only way out of the contract, you're going to need all of that. Generally, if you've got a breach, all you really need to do is have a lawyer write them a really nasty letter. And usually at that point, they're done arguing. Because remember, they're still governed by the Department of Real Estate. And if they're a really bad property manager, you're going to report them to the Department of Real Estate. Department of Real Estate is going to pull their license. And if it's really a bad situation, then the Department of Real Estate gets the Arizona Attorney General involved, and the Attorney General investigates them, and he goes after them for monetary losses. All right? Every property management agreement doesn't need to be exactly the same. Now, it seems like a lot of property managers are confused on that. It seems like a lot of them confuse the fact that every lease has to be exactly the same. And they think because every lease has to be the same, every property management agreement has to be the same. But that's not true. A property management agreement is considered a contract of equals. You're an investor. You're not a reasonable person. The fact that you have a buy and hold property makes you an investor. You're not a reasonable person. The property manager is a professional. He's not a reasonable person. So we got two unreasonable people signing a contract with each other, and they both get to negotiate whatever they want. When you got a reasonable person in there, Joe Public, then the contract has to protect Joe Public. But in this case, it doesn't. So a lease has to be uniform across everybody so you're not discriminating in any way. But when it comes to landlords, you can discriminate because it's a contract of equals, and unless you're outright doing something that's totally wrong, and I'll come back to some examples of that, like telling them they can't have a rental property in this area, they need to go south of the church. Unless you're doing something obviously stupid, you can have different terms in each property management agreement. Most property managers are going to say they can't do that. All the contracts have to be the same. That is not true. Every one of those contracts have a place you can write separate terms on. Every one of your contracts for property management ought to say if the manager doesn't live up to the terms of this agreement, at the managee or at the owner's sole discretion, depending on whatever they call you in that contract. Sometimes it's the managee, sometimes it's the owner, sometimes it's the landlord, should never be landlord, but whatever. At your sole discretion, this contract can be terminated with 30 days notice. That way, at least worst case scenario, you got 30 days and you're done with them. All right. Since Todd started this, let's look at a few property manager warning signs. My number one warning sign that you get a bad property manager, after you hire them, you never hear anything from them. You should at least hear from them once a month with the annual report saying nothing's going on other than what you see for the collecting rent. We're good. My number 2 irritant with property managers, they don't do the inspection. Property managers should do an inspection. Some property managers charge you more for extra inspections, but they ought to at least do a set of inspections. When I'm running my own properties, I like to drive by them at least once a quarter and make sure they're still standing. Now, it's not as funny as it sounds, but I like to have interior inspections done twice a year. I like to have the first interior inspection done somewhere between 3 and 4 months after the tenant moves in, because I get an idea how they're maintaining the property, and I get a chance to ask them about anything they've noted wrong with the property or any concerns that they have. And the tenant thinks I'm being nice to them, but what I'm really doing is I'm evaluating how they're maintaining my property. Now, the problem with inspections is every time you do an inspection, you got to give the tenant proper notice. In Arizona, that's 48 hours. In Texas, it's 24 hours. In Wisconsin, it's 5 days. Everywhere you go, you got to give the tenant the proper notice. So the tenant knows you're coming. If the house isn't clean when they know you're coming, you probably have a problem. And then I like to do an inspection 6 months after that. So basically, I've done an inspection in the first 3 to 4 months they've moved in. 6 months after that is month 9 or 10. So it's about the time for a lease renewal, or about the time where I can judge what's going to need to be done to the property when they move out. One thing I like to see a management company do is I like to see a management company, when they send in maintenance people, I like to see them require the maintenance person to document the condition of the house. For example, my AC guy called me up one day and said, "Hey, Chris, besides the AC is broken and we're fixing it, I just thought you ought to know the pool in the backyard's green. Here's a picture of it coming to your phone." Now, I don't know how many of you have had a green pool in Arizona, but you know, we got some really serious rules against having green pools and creating mosquito habitat. And it's anywhere between a $400 and a $4,000 fine and 1 year's probation if you get accused of it. When the tenant's responsible for maintaining the pool, I want to know that the pool's not in good condition. It's an example of how maintenance people can help you. When the property manager sends out his maintenance people to look at the kitchen, it's not that hard for the maintenance person to use their phone as a camera and take pictures of the house as they walk through, or have the camera running in video mode. It's not hard for the maintenance person to give a rundown of what they saw in the house. Understand, in some portions of the country, not so much Arizona, but when they go in to do maintenance on a water leak, they're probably going down the basement and then back up to where the leak was, because the basement's where the shutoff is. In the North Country, the shutoff's always an interior shutoff. It gives you an idea of what the property looks like when they're not expecting somebody to be there. Oh, excuse me. It gives you an idea what it's going to look like when they don't expect us to be there, and that's kind of important to the whole system.
Hey, Chris,
Yeah.
I got a question. We have a house that we're renting with a property management company, and I guess there's different schools of thought. Some people say, well, you should never meet the tenants. You really don't want them to know who you are, where you live, all that kind of stuff. That's why you hire the management company. But I love to go and look at property, because I do those sorts of things where if you're just cruising through the house, you're looking for certain things. What's your philosophy on, oh, you're really the owner, but the property management's doing quote, your dirty work or something.
Here's the thing I want you to remember about the manager. The manager's in charge of the property. They should be the only contact for the tenant. I don't want the tenant to know who I am. I don't want him to know where I live for two reasons. Number one, you hired the property manager to oversee the property. Let them do it. Number two, if the tenant knows who you are, they start calling you to create hardship between you and the property manager. And if it's a good professional tenant, they play you off of each other. And nobody wins that situation. You get rid of the manager because the tenant says he's not doing well, and then you find out how bad the tenant really is after he's done so much damage you can't afford to recover from it. So let the manager do it. Now, if you want to go see the house during one of the interior inspections, then you show up with the manager and they introduce you as their assistant. Yeah, that's one way. They should introduce you as their assistant. I mean, I've had management companies give me business cards, just blank business cards for them, saying I worked for them, and we went and did the inspection. But if you're going to do the inspection for the management company should require you to fill out the exact same forms that they would be using.
No, I don't want to do the inspection, but I want them to do it, and I kind of go along just to learn. So
Just to follow them.
Yeah.
As a property manager, about once a year, I'd let you do that because it's your house. More than that, then there's no reason to have me. You're annoying me. Having been a property manager, that's kind of the way I look at it.
The other question I had is when you were talking about truck parts, we've had people do work for us on occasion at our house, and it drives me crazy when I see a bag from Home Depot because they're usually junk parts and I end up fixing it. So how do you find somebody that goes to the plumbing supply and is buying commercial grade parts and not junk parts?
On a residential home, not even the home builders really use commercial grade parts. So most of the parts that go into a home are Home Depot parts. If you don't want the cheap stuff, you have to tell them you don't want the cheap stuff, but then you tend to pay for it. Understand, you can say Home Depot's junk parts, but if you go to the plumbing supply store down on Baseline and 19th Avenue,
Yep.
the PVC parts are exactly the same PVC parts that are in Home Depot. Same manufacturer, same stuff everywhere down the line.
No, I
The
get
only
that.
thing you might find different is some of the PEX equipment.
I'm not as concerned about what I call commodity items like pipe fittings. It's plumbing fixtures, because we have a friend who was a plumber, and he said he would get callbacks all the time because the fixtures were like B grade instead of A grade.
Yes, they're the A, B, and C grade to the fixtures. And if you're worried about how the fixtures that go in, you need to tell the property manager about that, what your requirement is for repairs. But if they're going to replace fixtures, they should be getting your okay before they do it.
Okay.
And understand, B grade fixtures between 180 and 300 bucks, and A grade fixture is going to be more than that. The builders get a cheaper rate on it because they're buying hundreds of them right off the docks in California and having them shipped here in storage containers.
Sure.
The property manager isn't replacing that many faucets to get that kind of a discount.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. What if your manager doesn't respond or isn't timely with tenant requested repairs? Think that creates an issue? Sure creates heartburn with the tenant, right? And if they're a professional tenant, it's even worse. One of the problems that we do have with tenants in Arizona right now is most of them aren't from here. I had a tenant that was from New York City, and they kept trying to tell me how rentals work in New York City. And I finally got disgusted with them, and I said, well, you know, Ron, you and your wife click your heels together, and maybe Dorothy will come and take you back to New York City. But here, We don't work that way. Here's how this is going to work. If you don't like it, you can always move out. That's part of being a landlord, but you also need, the reason we're having that conversation with the tenant is because we're responding. We're responding in a timely manner. I mean, the tenant tried to explain that the countertop was broke. Well, the problem is, I agree the countertop was broke. I don't know what sat on it, but it broke it. The countertop didn't just break on its own. It was Corian, for God's sake. It didn't break on its own. It's clearly tenant-caused damage. Well, in New York, I'd get to move to a motel, and you'd have to pay for it until you fix that, whether I broke it or not. We ain't in New York. This is Arizona. You broke it. I'll have somebody come in and fix it when they have time. Until then, you can stay here. It's a nuisance repair. Arizona, it's not a health and safety repair. You want your manager to respond in a timely manner. Last thing on earth you want is to have a manager managing a property and have a tenant finally figure out who you are and how to get a hold of you and say the manager's not doing any repairs. And I'll be willing to bet you, not only is that manager not doing repairs, he's probably billed you for repairs he didn't do. That's a real common scheme when somebody called, I was reading earlier an article somebody wrote, and they called it an evil manager. Well, that's as good a description as any. If a property manager is doing too many evictions or has too many bad tenants, you probably don't want to keep them, right? No reports, no monthly reports, we already said. How about charging more than 10% or 1 month's finder's fee? 10% monthly take and 1 month's finder fee for a tenant. Today, we don't always charge finder's fees. A lot of managers charge real estate commission. But what it used to be, and what it still is sometimes, especially with managers that have been around for more than 10 years, is they charge what's called a finder's fee, and it's equivalent to 1 month's rent. So if your rent's $1,000, the finder's fee is $1,000. Now, is my rent really $1,000? What is it, Todd?
It's less because you have a management fee and whatever else that it needs to come out of that.
Right. I have a 10% management fee in this example, so my rent's actually only $900. So when I'm talking to the manager and they say they charge 1 month's finder's fee, that 1 month's finder's fee is what I get. And I always make that a statement. You can charge 1 month's finder's fee, but I only get $900 out of the $1,000. So that month you get $900 and I get the extra $100. Most managers are a little shocked that I actually think about that. But it's still your business, right? One of the things that I always like to make sure, and one of the easiest ways to get into trouble in your rentals, is for you not to know the rules. You're hiring the manager because they should know the rules, right? One of the rules the manager should know, if I start looking at what a manager should be familiar with legally, it's really two things. They should know about fair housing. If we're in a multifamily property, they need to know about EEOC too. EEOC is an extension of fair housing that only deals with multifamily buildings or commercial buildings. And single family residential, they just need to know fair housing law. So one of the easiest questions to ask them is, tenant shows up with a comfort animal. What do you do? For those of you that don't know the answer is it's not an animal, it's a prescription. And they can't not let that person move in because they have a comfort animal. However, thanks to recent court decisions, it must be a common animal like a dog or a cat, maybe a bird. It can't be uncommon animals anymore. It's got to be a true pet animal. 90% dog or cat. So what the answer should be is because it's a comfort animal and they told us that it's no longer an animal, it's a prescription. We would need to verify the prescription was written by a legal person that can write the prescription, which in Arizona is a doctor. In other states, it's almost anybody, but in Arizona, it's a doctor. California, it can be a masseuse. Arizona, it's a doctor. We need to verify the prescription. We need to verify it with the doctor. We will get a copy of it. We can't charge them extra rent. We can't charge them extra security deposit. They are fully responsible for any damage done with the animal. And that should be the answer. It's the fastest way to know whether they know about fair housing. The second question today, that's a good question to ask, is what if the person shows up and they're a felon? Again, thanks to the Ninth Circuit Court in the area we live in, if they're a felon, we can't discriminate against them because they're a felon. A felon isn't a legal discriminatory class in the fair housing. However, the Ninth Circuit Court has said felons disproportionately harm people of race or color. Therefore, it's discriminatory in its essence. So we can't discriminate against the felony. So the next question we ask is what type of felony? There's some lawyers that say you can't ask that, but we can ask if it was a personal injury felony that might make it dangerous for other tenants or not. If it's not, we can't do much with it. We should find that out in their record, by the way. But we can't not rent to them just because they're a felon. Those are the two easiest questions to ask about fair housing. Disclosures. What's the number one disclosure that they have to give depending on how old the house is? Lead-based paint. So the question I always ask is lead-based paint disclosure. When do you have to give it? 1978 or less. After 1978, you don't have to. Now, that's in Arizona. In California, every tenant must get a lead-based paint disclosure, regardless of the age of the house. Because you know, Dan's a cheap bastard. He might have gone and gotten some cheap lead-based paint that hasn't been manufactured since 1980. He might have gone and found 50 gallons of it and painted the inside of his house with it. But in Arizona, it's 1978 or earlier.
I'm sure they have lead-based paint on Craigslist, right?
I'm sure you probably find it. It was used in World War II on the submarines and nobody wants it anymore.
Is definitely in your backdrop.
It's definitely in my backdrop. Could be. The house was that age, but since all the drywall's gone, it's not anymore. Deductions. Deductions and deposit are the same thing. It's a good way to find out how professional they are. Ask them what can be deducted from the deposit when the tenant moves out. The answer is normal wear and tear. Or not normal wear and tear. Which one's the answer? Clearly not. Damages done that are not normal wear and tear can be deducted from the deposit. And they should be at the same time, they should tell you in Arizona, you got 14 days to give them notice of the deductions. You don't have to give them the deposit back, but you got to give them notice of what you're going to charge the deposit. Normally, we give that back. All right?
Chris,
If they don't have knowledge of that, that's the easiest way for a property management company to get you sued. Because if it's a fair housing lawsuit, the attorney general for the state is going to file the lawsuit, and they're going to file it against everybody. And when you're accused of a fair housing violation, whether you did it or not, you have to prove you're not responsible. It's not innocent until proven guilty. It's guilty until you prove otherwise.
Chris,
Yep.
For the benefit of the group, can you, because wear and tear is somewhat subjective, can you kind of give some examples?
Well, for example, if you go in your house and there's holes in the wall, that's not wear and tear. That's damage. But if you go in your house and there's one wall that's painted bright white and the other three walls are painted a lighter white, like Swiss coffee, that would be the tenant trying to repair the wall before they moved out. That's normal wear and tear. If the wall is full of little nail holes where they hung pictures up throughout the house, that's normal wear and tear. If you have one wall that's solid nail holes, that's damage. If you go in and find a big red stain on the carpeting, that's damage. If you go in and find wear patterns on the carpeting, that's normal wear and tear. Get the idea? Because you don't think it's normal is irrelevant. It's what a judge is going to see that's normal. And understand, a tenant doesn't vacuum your carpet the way you do. They don't clean things the way you do. So wear patterns on the carpet from where they've walked and never vacuumed is normal wear and tear. But a big red stain in the middle of the carpet would not be normal wear and tear. That would be damage. Let's see. Property manager warning signs. They intimidate you or your tenants. They browbeat you into agreeing. We've had property managers that, for the committee I've sat on, that actually went in and would regularly threaten tenants with evictions, even though they never provided a notice. Can't do that. You can't threaten a tenant with an eviction unless you've actually given them a notice for why you're evicting them. Otherwise, it's considered threatening. Now, what some people don't remember is in Arizona, if a tenant threatens me with physical injury, I can get a 24-hour eviction, a hostile eviction, and get them out of there. If he threatens me or any of the people I send out. But understand, if I go out and threaten the tenant can get a restraining order that keeps me as the manager from ever going near that property. Which means there's no inspections being done. A property manager that has that intimidation effect, I call it the New York effect, has that New York attitude, is not the manager you want. If they're not willing to sit and talk with you, they're not the right people. One of my pet peeves with property managers, especially small offices or new property managers, is they have limited hours. Commonly, what you'll see is they're open during business hours, and you ask them what happens after business hours, all the calls go to voicemail. That doesn't work. If you've got a health and safety repair, that tenant's got to be able to talk to a live person in a reasonable amount of time. In Arizona, the reasonable amount of time is considered an hour, not 3 days. Property managers should have business hours, and then they should have some sort of after-hours support system that people can get to. I mean, if you were landlording your own property, they would call your phone and get you whenever you answered your phone, right? And if they called your phone and left a message because you were out somewhere, soon as you got the message, you would call them back, right? Even in the old days when we had answering machines, we did that. Today, we all carry phones in our frickin' pockets. There should be a way to contact the manager 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. If they don't have a method set up like that, they're not even worth talking to. And if you call them after hours and they don't get back to you for 3 or 4 days, they're doing the same thing to your tenants. That's how minor repairs become big repairs and how your habitability cert gets pulled. We talked about vacancy rates. I don't need to talk about that again. Property managers. There should be a suite of services that they provide you with. We'll go over them. Property managers that only collect rent and don't screen tenants aren't property managers. The stuff that we started with, and I think it's still on your screen, they should do all of that at a minimum. That should be the bare minimum. Other services might be provided for a cost, but if they don't do everything on that slide, they're not property managers. They're pretenders. A property manager ought to be able to give you references. I've had them refuse to give me references. When they refuse to give you references, they're really telling you they don't have anybody that likes them. But that way. If a property manager is bouncing checks to you or paying you late, should you be keeping them? No. And yet, it's amazing. I hear from people that have a property manager, well, they bounced a check last month. What do you think I should do? I think you should go fire them right now. I think you should demand certified funds for everything else after that. That's what we would do to a tenant. Why would you treat a property manager any other way? If they're not paying you or they're bouncing checks, something's wrong. You need to get out of there as fast as you can. Not paying you is a breach on the property management agreement, period, unless you left the payment terms open. I said we can play the Department of Real Estate, right? So let's take a quick look at some fees. I'll start with talking about it, then I'm going to switch to some other slides here to help out a little bit. Property managers. Somewhere between 8 and 12% is what's charged generally. The less units you have, the more they charge. The more they offer, the more they charge. National average, 10% is pretty much average. Now understand it's 10% of the gross monthly rent. When you're talking to the manager, you want to make sure it's 10% of the gross monthly rent, not including rental tax. Now, rental tax isn't much, the excise tax on rentals. But in some areas, even here in Arizona, it can be up to $100 for a rental unit per month. The tenant's paying the extra $100, but if the manager's taking 10% of it, that means every month you're coming up with $10 extra to pay the rental tax. The manager should not be charging the 10% take on the rental tax. So it's the gross monthly rent minus rental tax. Now, gross monthly rent, not gross rent collected. Because rent collected could also have fees and fines in it for stuff that they didn't do, right? If they got to reimburse you next month for some repairs you did, that would be part of the monthly rent check. But it's not the gross rent collected, it's gross monthly rent. All right? A lot of people say due or collected, and we start getting confused then. There's a lot of management companies that say they'll charge 10% of the gross monthly rent due. That means if your unit's vacant, they still get rent they still get their 10%, whether they collected rent or not. When they say 10% of gross monthly rent collected, that means they're only getting 10% of what they collected. That's what they should all say. But that's gross monthly rent, not gross rent collected. Two different uses of collected that sometimes get confused. Everybody asks about flat rates. Back in 2008-9, it was popular to do flat rates. Then the market collapsed. Flat rates, by and large, went with it. You know, you kind of get what you pay for. If you don't want to pay much in real estate commission, you use one of the flat rate commission brokerages. And you get little or no representation. They may or may not fill out the contract for you. They may or may not tell you what the contract says. They may or may not even know what a contract is. You get what you pay for. Flat rate services are flat rate because they charge you a low service to get your rent, but then they charge you for absolutely everything else, and they charge you a lot more for it. It's not unusual to have early cancellation fees in your contract. We already talked about that, right? You're going to put in there what? If they breach the contract, the owner, or whatever they call you in the management agreement, at their sole discretion, may terminate the contract in 30 days. So what's your early cancellation fee? The rent for 30 days, 1 month. A la carte management fees. The lower your management fee, likely the more costs you have. So what are some of the common costs they give you? Number one is a setup fee. Number one thing to look at from a management company after the monthly take, which will generally be 10%, is what your account setup fee is. My opinion, there should be no setup fee for creating an account for me. They're going to get their money out of the 10% collected, and that's what they're already using to pay all the normal fees for me. There should be no other setup fee. Every time they put a new tenant in, there should be no setup fee. They already got paid to find the tenant one way or another. There shouldn't be a setup fee. In my opinion, setup fees are a way for the management company to make extra money off of me. Vacancy, my opinion, no collect rent, no get paid. Units vacant, I'm paying you to find a new tenant. Whether I'm paying you real estate commission to find the tenant or I'm paying you a monthly fee to find the tenant, I don't really care. I'm paying you to find the tenant. When you find the tenant, there's no vacancy. If I'm paying you when there's a vacancy, how much push do you have on finding me a tenant?
Well, that sounds like what's going on right now.
If I don't pay you for the vacancy, then you're going to find me a tenant as fast as you can and put them in there. So, advertising fees. We pay advertising fees. Every property manager should have a list of fees that are normal. And they should have a list of advertisements that they do. Anything I want done beyond that normal suite of advertising to find a tenant for me, I would have to pay for. That's reasonable. But there ought to be a set of advertisements that they generally do that leads to their tenants. And I shouldn't be paying for that. That's already part of filling the vacancy. If they say they're putting it in MLS and then they're putting it on Zillow and Redfin and they start naming off websites, MLS is doing all that. They're not. That's already covered in finding the damn vacancy, filling the vacancy. If I want to advertise in a newspaper, it's probably not being advertised in a newspaper. Nobody uses newspapers anymore. But if I wanted to advertise in the local newspaper, whatever it is, the Northwest News, then I should have to pay for that advertisement because that's something the manager normally wouldn't do. All right, so I pay for extra advertisement, but not the regular advertisement. Leasing, we already talked about. What about a lease renewal? Should there be a fee for a lease renewal?
I say no.
Well, I get hit for it.
I would
It's
hit you
not-
for it too if you were using me.
Yeah, it's not the same as a new lease when they're getting a deal, but a tenant, but they do hit me for a lease renewal.
Now, here's the problem. Here's the reason that I say they should get it. They're still going out and they still got to talk to the tenant. They still got to prepare the lease. They still got to make sure nothing's changed in the tenant's history. So they've still got to do a bunch of work. Now, if it's $1,000 to find a new tenant for a vacancy, then it sure in the hell shouldn't be $1,000 to do a lease renewal. It should be roughly half that because they're only doing one side of things. So I think you should pay for the lease renewal, but it shouldn't be the same as the normal lease. They're not going out and physically finding them. It shouldn't be a full set of fees again. How about maintenance? Should there be a charge for maintenance? Sure, a reasonable charge. And the reasonable charge is whatever the maintenance people charge. Now, again, I want to push this again. If after the tenant moves out, because you're not there, the manager is now overseeing getting the house back into rental condition, and he's got several trades coming in that case, they got somebody overseeing the job. There should be an extra charge for that person. And usually that works out to be some sort of flat rate on top of everything. Every time I've ever had a management company, my charge to oversee the project was 10%. 10% of the project cost. So take all the bills, add them up, add 10% on it, and that's what we got. The contractor's bills that you paid, though, were the contractor's bills. They weren't my bills. And you should get a copy of the contractor's bills for that matter. They should come as part of your statement. How about evictions? Who pays for evictions? That's a tough one, huh?
Man, I got beat up by this. It was the 5-day notice charge, and then the taking partial payment for a month, and then the 5-day notice charge, and then taking, it was just going on and on.
All right. First off, the property manager shouldn't have taken a partial payment. They should have known what they were doing, and they should not have done that. That's their responsibility. The 5-day notice. The charge for preparing a 5-day notice should be charged to the tenant and should be pursued as part of the tenant's eviction and what they owe you back. Now, if there's not enough in the security deposit to cover it, that's a whole nother issue. But when you evict the tenant, you've got a security deposit sitting there, and any charges that are given by the court can be directly applied to that security deposit. And the way it works, security deposit, unpaid rent first, eviction fees second, other fees after that. So all the doc prep fees should go to the tenant. Now, the court normally won't allow you to charge them the eviction fee too. Sometimes the court will give you the eviction fee, and Texas, they'll always give it to you. In Arizona, they won't always. So you might have to pay an eviction fee. But it sure ought to be some reasonable fee. I often argue this with the property managers. You put the tenant in there, you told me they were good, unless there's been a life-changing event on that tenant, and life-changing events happen. I mean, I've had tenants where one or the other died and suddenly the spouse is not completely there. I've had tenants where they've had heart attacks. I've had tenants that were going through cancer treatment. I've had tenants that got divorced. When a life-changing event happens on a tenant, that's something neither the property manager nor you could predict. In that case, I agree, as the homeowner, getting rid of the tenant is better than keeping them in there. That is my cost. I'd rather get rid of them than have another lost month's rent. After all, an eviction is only going to cost me somewhere around $345, $500 in Arizona. But if it's not a life-changing event, then somebody screwed up the screening of the tenant. As a matter of fact, in my management agreements, when I sign them, it says that the tenant's evicted in the first 6 months, the manager is wholly responsible for all costs evicting the tenant. Because they screwed up, they didn't do their screening right. How about check fees? It's real common today to have check fees. I have a couple, last management company I had a couple landlords over in Sun City that didn't want direct deposits in their bank account. They wanted cash. Well, the only way to get cash is to write a check and have them go to the bank and cash it, because I'm not going to walk over there with $100 bills. Every time we do checks, there's a check fee for writing the check because it's more expensive than doing electronic signatures anymore. So that's common. And then there's paper fees. If they have to prepare other documents, some property managers charge you for paper fees. Paper fees to me are the same as saying crap fees. So if we look at the screen again, get my cursor to go over to the right screen. Here's an example of a property management scenario run by one of the Valley property management companies, pretty good property management company. And it goes over the difference in how they do their monthly fees. And you notice with each higher level monthly fees, you get a little more services. Some of this stuff is relatively new and I won't go over all of it, but point out a couple of the things for you. A tenant finder fee is part of the gross lease. Is relatively new. And you see here, basically they're taking real estate commission and they're just lowering it based on how much you're paying a month. Now, I wouldn't agree to that necessarily, but it's nice that they're making an offer. You notice they got their normal marketing, online marketing and advertising. It's included across the board. Tenant screening and selection is included. Basically, this column right here is everything a property management company should be doing at the basic level. Right? You notice down here, the next one, 6-month tenant guarantee at 10%. That's something that's relatively new in the property management industry. What that is they're guaranteeing the tenant stays in place and pays rent for 6 months. If the tenant doesn't, they're responsible to pay you the rent and find a new tenant as quickly as possible. You notice in their even higher level down here at 12%, they've got a 12-month tenant guarantee. So at 12% monthly rent, they're going to guarantee you all 12 months of rent no matter what. Now, does the property manager actually pay for that? Yes and no. What the property manager does, and they put it down here, they have an insurance policy. And the insurance policy pays for that. In case you haven't heard this lately, there's new landlord protection insurance out there available. If you're a landlord, you might want to look into it. It guarantees you your rent with certain criteria. If the tenant is screened correctly coming in, it'll guarantee you their rent should anything happen. Not only does it guarantee you your rent if the tenant's not paying it, and you have to process an eviction, it guarantees you your rent if something happens to the house and it's damaged in any way that makes it a constructive eviction on the tenant. So for example, it's 120 degrees outside today or whatever in the heck it ended up being. As my mom used to say, as close to hell on earth as you can come. Your air conditioning quits working because the tenant's trying to keep it at 76 degrees, and those 1986 air conditioners couldn't do that ever, even when they were new. So the air conditioning quits working. Years ago, like more than 5 years ago, in Arizona, air conditioning was not required for summer. It was not a reason for a tenant to get out of a lease. It just sucked to be them, just like it sucks to be you if your air conditioning quits working. Today, that's not true. Today, we have lots of judges that weren't from Arizona, they're from other places, and they can't imagine living without air conditioning, so they can't imagine a tenant doing it. Some days I just want to go break their air conditioner so they can see what it's like, so they shut the hell up. But anyway, they consider the air conditioning to be health and safety. So if an air conditioning quits working and you can't repair it within a reasonable amount of time, which to some judges is 24 hours, to some judges is 36 hours, very rarely more than that. If you can't repair it in that time, the tenant can take your rent and go stay in a motel until you can repair it. The landlord protection insurance reimburses you for the lost rent for that. Because after all, it's not you that's not getting the AC guy up there, right? Right? Right now, if you call an AC guy and say, my AC's out, you'll be lucky if they show up in 3 days. Because they're busy. And if the AC is seriously damaged, then we get into the parts problems where even the supply houses don't have all the parts because we have this forced shortage on everything right now. So it may be a week before that AC is fixed. I mean, one of my agents here lost their AC 2 weeks ago, and the whole warranty company couldn't find anybody that could get out there in less than 4 days. If that had been a tenant, they'd have gotten to get out. So having this insurance policy is not bad. Landlords are using it. Property managers are using it. You should use it. In their case, this company is also providing you this insurance over here on this level.
Chris,
Yep.
this has not happened, but I'm just curious. What if they have a pet, especially if it's a comfort pet, and the AC goes down, you can't get somebody out there for 4 or 5 days? Are you going to have to also put that pet in a pet hotel or something?
No, you're not responsible for putting that pet anywhere. They have to be able to take the pet with them, or they have to stay and suffer with the pet. The pet's their responsibility as a comfort pet.
Okay.
You have no responsibility for it. You just can't screen against it. This is a good analysis of what most properties do. You notice they have an annual site visit, photos and reports. When I see this here, I want to see video too. I want them to take photos of what they see in the house, but I want them to walk through with the video and shoot video of the entire house. Basically, what I want them to do is I want them to go stand in the room and do a 360 video shot of the entire room. Floor to ceiling, and then across the floor and across the ceiling. I want them to do it in every room of the house. I'm not interested in what the people have, but because it's my house, they have a right to take photos and video, and I want video, and I want them both to me. Now, when you go to court, the video is for me to see other stuff in. When you go to court, you never bring the video to court. You always bring the photos. Because the video doesn't always show up damages as well as the individual photo. And the whole wall may look good except that one little spot. And a judge may decide it wasn't important. But if you bring in the photo and it just shows that spot, there's nothing else to decide on. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Hard-learned experience. These how-to videos, general, I can tell you most of those come off from Mr. Landlord. They're junk for me. Semi-annual drive-by checks to me is something stupid. They ought to be doing that anyway. They ought to be doing semi-annual visits. That's one thing I don't like here. This virtual tours and floor plans is using the new cameras to generate them. It's nothing special. You can hire somebody to do that for $100 just in case you're looking. MLS marketing and syndication. That sounds really nice if you're from California. If you're from Arizona, you're saying, so? Unfortunately, the only thing that they're really giving you under this category here is a 12-month tenant guarantee, which is through the insurance policy. I'm going to tell you right now that you could take this one right here, get 90% of this, and the 12-month guarantee with the insurance policy would be less than what you would pay right here for the extra 2%. Some of your insurance companies that are doing your renter's insurance or your rental insurance will provide that. For example, Foremost will provide it. It can be a rider on your insurance policy. Farm Bureau will supply it. So you don't necessarily need to use these guys. You can use anybody you want. But you ought to ask your homeowner's insurance if they're going to do it already.
So you can do it even if you have a property management company?
You can do it on your own, yeah. Then you don't need the property manager to do it.
Oh, okay. But even if you've hired the property management company, you can then supplement it with the insurance?
Yes. Yep. Basically, the way insurance works, the reason we have a homeowner's policy and a tenant has a renter's policy and a property manager has their liability policy and then you have your liability rider, they're going to start at the lowest level to pay for the damage and move up based on who's responsible. So if there's water damage to the property, they're going to look for the tenant's policy, the tenant's renter's policy to pay for the damage that they caused. And then they're going to look for your homeowner's policy. If somebody gets hurt in the property, they're going to look at the renter's policy, your homeowner's policy, and the property manager's liability policy. And insurance companies are going to look at it and they're going to negotiate amongst themselves.
Okay.
This is a good example of services that a manager does for your own perusal. You don't need me to read this all to you. It's a waste of time. The only one I want to point out is one other reason that's not often talked about if you're hiring a property manager is in every state in the nation, if you have a rental property, there must be a local person that the government can send notices to, and the government being the state or city governments. They must have a local person that they can give notices to on your behalf. So you need a statutory agent in the state for out-of-town owners. The property manager is that statutory agent. If you're going to be a landlord and landlord your own properties, then you've only got two choices for that. You have somebody else you're paying to receive your mail. It's got to be a person, not a mailbox. It's got to be a person. You got to have somebody that's paid to receive your mail, which is usually an accountant or a lawyer, or it goes directly to the tenant. But if it goes to the tenant, you may never see it if it's the tenant's fault, right? So one of the other reasons that you hire a property manager is right down here. And you need to keep that in mind when you're looking at using property managers. Enough of that's not said. Other than that, this is all stuff we've already talked about. Now, I like the fact that they got lease only, owner managed. What does that mean? This means they find you the tenant, they screen the tenant, but everything else is done by you. Security deposits, everything is all done by you. They do say here that they prepare a lease agreement, but they're just acting as your agent preparing the lease agreement. So in this one right here, they're acting as a real estate agent. In this one over here, they're acting as a manager.
So I have a question. So in the lease only owner managed, out of state, owner carryback, with a fiduciary, with somebody there to get your mail, would that play out? Because you run into that with insurance, right?
Sure.
The insurance is asking you that.
Sure.
So
As long as you have a statutory agent there that can receive your information, you're good.
okay,
You don't need to have the full management suite if you don't want it.
right.
Now, if I'm doing a lease option, I don't need a manager. But if I'm doing a tenant-owned property, my rule is if I'm not in the state where the property is, I need a manager. If the city's more than 2 hours away from me, I need a manager. If I'm doing a landlorded property. If the property is multifamily and it's more than 2 hours away from me, I need a manager. And multifamily kind of changes. If it's under 8 units, if it's not such a big deal. I can have a service person that lives in the area that takes care of 90% of the stuff. But when I start getting over 20 units, 20, 25 units, now I need a manager. I need somebody that's going to see that because 20, 25 units at any given time, I've got 1 or 2 available for renting as people move in and out. So I've suddenly got a need for more management time. But there I need a management that's going to have for 1 or 2 available for renting. I need a manager that's not full-time on the property, but yet can be at the property really quick. So I'm looking for a manager that's got 5 or 6 units right there that has the manager full-time at, and they're just subserving the other units. Software. Property manager should be using software. If you're going to be a property manager or you're going to be a landlord, you should have software. I've already told you the best program that I know of is Appfolio. But Appfolio is based on size and numbers of units you have. Size is always number of units. It gets expensive. Probably the best cheap programs, in my opinion, are Cozy, Rent Tech Direct, Rent Tracker, or Tenant Cloud. Usually those ones are free or very low cost, depending on how many you have. For most of you, you'll never get to 75, but some of them have a limit between 50 and 75, and then they don't work anymore. Then you need to go to one of the bigger ones. A couple other bigger ones that I actually like if you don't like Appfolio because it's too expensive. Propertyware is really good. And Landlord Studio is really good. Also, Simplify EM is pretty good too if you get the right package. Simplify EM, the problem is figuring out which one you want. They all do commercial, residential, and multifamily.
What were the names of the last 3?
The last 3 were Simplify EM, Landlord Studio. And which other one did I give you? Propertyware?
Yep.
They're all good programs. Some of them even work on your cell phones, on your Android phones. I don't know if they work on Apple. I don't use Apple. But they work on your Android phones. They're all good programs. All of them have a feed that'll go right into your QuickBooks and keep you updated on your QuickBooks. So I want to summarize, and then I'll turn this over for any questions you have. What should your manager do? Your manager should find quality tenants fast. Quality tenants fast. I mean, there's no reason you should be having any more than a 30-day vacancy if the property manager is a professional manager. They should have a wait list of people moving in, especially right now. They should collect rent on time. When's rent due? Get used to it. Rent's due the first of the month, never any other day. If the tenant moves in halfway through the month, the rent gets prorated based on the first of the month. So rent's always collected on the first of the month, which means you should always have your check the 3rd through the 5th, which means you got your check in plenty of time to pay your mortgage. They should keep you updated on all maintenance and repairs. They should also keep you updated on all financials for your rental unit. They should manage all maintenance and repairs. You're not there. They should manage it. They shouldn't bill you extra for it. They should be the one and only contact for the tenants. One of the worst mistakes I ever made as a landlord was having a property next to me as a rental. Because I was managing my own. The tenant always knew where we lived, and all he ever did was come over and want something. And last of all, but not least, the manager should do evictions. Dan gave you some tenant screening tips. Those were good. I wanted to give you some examples of fair housing discrimination that have been caught in the last 2 months. Requiring a renter to pay an additional security deposit, but not all renters are required to pay the extra. You notice we didn't say anything about anything on the tenant. We just said requiring a tenant to pay an extra security deposit, but not other tenants. The cost on that to the landlord was $7,500 plus court costs. Asking if the rental applicant has kids during a casual conversation because they were in an aged home area. The fact that you're in an aged home area doesn't allow you to ask if they have kids. You're allowed to state that this is an aged home area and kids cannot be in this area based on the deed restrictions, but you can't ask if they have kids to screen against it. That landlord actually got out of it because they had a legitimate reason for asking, but they were still admonished that they had done it wrong. It still cost them the court fees. They had to pay not only their side of the court fees, but they had to pay the plaintiff's court fees too. Describing a property as family friendly in a rental ad. This one actually didn't come out of Arizona, came out of Illinois, but I had to include it. The court's decision was, and I'll read this to you, I made sure I wrote it down so I would remember it. A family-friendly property description is discriminatory towards familial status, which is one of the protected clauses of the FHA Fair Housing Amendment, because applicants could reasonably conclude that families are preferred as tenants and those without families are not.
Oh my gosh.
$5,000.
Wow.
Plus, because they're a business, they got a $10,000 fine on the business for violating fair housing. And the sad part is what they're doing now is they're going back and looking to see if they did it on any of their other rentals. This happens to be a multifamily building. I guarantee you they're going to find more. If this guy gets out of here without a $100,000 fine, I'll be surprised. Asking for verification of immigration or citizenship status. This is a new one. This didn't exist before 2018. It really didn't exist before 2014. The change came out in 2014. Technically, it went into law in 2016, but nobody really knew what to do with it until 2018. But since we're sitting in the area that's governed by the 9th District Court of Appeals,
San Francisco.
yeah, and San Francisco is the original founding authority on this, I'm just going to read it to you. It's illegal to discriminate against national origin. Asking if a rental applicant to verify their citizenship would violate this right. Asking the rental applicant to verify they're in this country legally would verify this right. Now, I could read you another decision that comes out of a different court that disagrees with everything I just said. But we're in the Ninth Circuit Court, so we got to agree with it because they're the ones that we have to appeal to until the Supreme Court does something else. One more and we'll call it done. You can't tell your renters that you need to go to the church down the street. Religion is a protected class, and a landlord who references their own religious preferences can make a renter feel like the landlord prefers tenants with similar religious beliefs.
Was that out of Utah?
No, I was going to use Utah as my second example, though. That happens in Utah all the time, right? How does Utah get away with it? How do the Mormons get away with it?
They just know what area zip code they're supposed to live in.
No. The Mormon church owns the majority of the property. Y'all understand that there's in Utah, even though some of the people own their own property, in Salt Lake City, Greater Salt Lake City, the Mormon church owns the majority of the property. The Mormon church, as a church, can decide who lives there. They're exempt for now. But outside of that, they're not exempt. By the way, Utah isn't part of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. They're part of Denver, which is becoming just as bad, but slowly. All right, we'll call that done. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask? I'm going to stop my share.
I had one question on the AC when it breaks and they're saying that you have to pay for them to move to live at a hotel or whatever. Do you prorate per day of what the rent would be per day, and that's what you give them?
No, it's whatever the hotel costs, and they can use up to your entire month's rent to fund the hotel. So if they want to go stay, I know we don't have a Ritz-Carlton here, but if they want to go stay at the Ritz-Carlton and it's $1,000 a day, and your rent is $1,000, they can use your entire month's rent for that one day.
And even if it happened on July 30th?
Yep. Yep, it would be next month's rent, but yep. Now, you could try to argue that, but that's a hard argument to win. The better argument to win is they shouldn't have needed to go there. We did everything we could to get it fixed. We had no power over it, just like you wouldn't. But I can tell you, I've made that argument, and I've had judges say, that's too bad, sucks to be you, you're the landlord. One of the biggest problems I have with being a landlord is they always assume you're rich.
Right.
They always assume you're better off than they are. It's like one of the excuses I used to give that a tenant gave me for not paying rent. Since I got a new truck, he shouldn't have to pay rent because he didn't have a new truck. One doesn't have anything to do with the other, but whatever.
Right.
Good question. Other questions, comments, concerns?
So I have a question, because you were going through the fair housing complaints, the ones that get you hammered for $7,000 and all this different stuff, right? So does that include if you're doing like owner carryback?
Owner carryback would still be lending is subject to fair housing.
Okay.
Lenders can't discriminate.
Okay.
So from that aspect, yes.
Okay. Because that's kind of scary. Some of those things that you were family friendly community, and then I've even in one situation, I didn't ask them if they had documentation for being legal or illegal. I asked them for their ID.
There's nothing wrong with asking them for an ID.
They didn't have it. So I just automatically knew that what was up.
Are you talking about like a driver's license?
Yeah, driver's license or foreigner ID card or whatever they have.
Right, just
government issued ID.
Mm-hmm.
I've asked for that and gotten the Mexican driver's license.
Right.
I've asked
So
for
that's
that and
what I was
gotten
just
passports
curious.
too.
Is that a safe way of getting the same information?
You can ask for an ID as long as you ask everybody for an ID.
Okay.
Remember, there's things you can and can't do, and there's things you can do as long as you do it for everybody.
Consistently.
You can ask for an ID so the person can prove who they are. That's allowed.
Okay.
And you can make a copy of that ID to go in the file as long as you keep it all together and you do it for everybody. That's allowed.
Okay.
When you're selling a house, can you say it's a family-friendly house? Sure.
Mhm.
But when you're advertising for tenants, they decided you couldn't, which was kind of a weird, the reason I had it in there is kind of a weird interpretation of the rule. But that's not that abnormal that goes on. We do that stuff. As a lender, you can't discriminate in any way against a person. You have to treat everybody the same, and much like a landlord, you have to take the first qualified person that comes in. If they're qualified, you have to take them. The only ways out of fair housing is religious, if it's owned by the religion. It's a room in your house and you live there. So it's your health and safety. The other rules have kind of been violated. Those are the only two really left. I mean, there's a couple others of them floating around, but in Arizona, you get away with it. But if it gets appealed to the Ninth Circuit, you wouldn't. In Arizona, though, if you're one of the other two exceptions, you won't even get notice from the Attorney General's office. 9 times out of 10, unless the Fed gets involved, it's the Attorney General's office for the state that prosecutes fair housing violations. Now understand, fair housing applies to single-family residences, commercial, and multifamily. But equal access only applies to commercial and multifamily, not residential. So for example, if you got a multifamily and a handicapped person wants to move in, they've got to get the first parking space nearest the door, and you have to make reasonable accommodations within the property for them, including doing upgrades like ramps. In a single family home, that doesn't apply. So if they need ramps, they got to put them in themselves. And then they got to turn the house back into the condition it was in before they moved in. So there's a difference between single and multi at that point. Technically, if it's multi-family, you got to put an elevator in if it's more than 2 stories. That's why you see these outside elevators now.
Chris, do you know if fair housing has any shoppers? Or what I mean by that is agents that pretend to be renters to...
Yes, and we're seeing them again.
Okay, because somebody told me they've run into a few, and I was like, I thought maybe they were cut back.
We hadn't seen them for the better part of 2 years. And then the last 4 or 5 months, we've started to see them again.
Okay.
And we've really seen them bad in the last 3 or 4 months. Basically, since the start of March, we've been seeing them.
Any
And
particular areas?
right through the shutdown, we've been seeing them.
Okay.
And yeah, you can tell them. If you're out watching the neighborhood, you'll see the white van pull up, and they seem to be white vans these days. You'll see the white van pull up, and you'll see 3 or 4 different races get out of it. You'll see a couple handicaps get out of it. And they'll just start going down the street applying, whether it's for sale houses or for rent houses. We'll see them at both.
Okay.
You'll even see them at open houses occasionally. But see, when you're doing rentals, they have a right to apply. When you're doing for sale, you cannot refuse to show them the house. You got to show it to them. You can't refuse to show it to them. But you don't have to do anything else because they got to get a loan and come in and prove that they have a loan to buy the house to write the contract. So if they got a loan document, you can write on the house, but a seller doesn't have to accept anything. It doesn't have to give you a reason why they didn't accept it. And fair housing, the fair housing testers that come out aren't from the city. They're not from the Attorney General's office. They're from an independent third party who's playing their games. They would like to be able to find homeowners and sue homeowners for not selling their homes because they may not like the person. But they can't prove that on homeowners. They can prove it on landlords much easier. So they spend their time there.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
When you were talking about the ESA animals, they have to have the letter. You said that it's like a prescription.
It's a
So those-
prescription they have to have, yes.
Okay, and it has to be an MDDO, or can it
Has
be
to be
from?
somebody that's legal to write the prescription for the area that you're in. The problem we're having right now is people coming from California. Basically, anybody in California can write a prescription. I swear it's that bad.
Mhm.
I mean, you can go to an herbalist and he can write a prescription, which means he can legally write a prescription for a comfort animal. In Arizona, it's got to be somebody that can write a prescription. So a DO, an MD, a true doctor, a nurse practitioner, somebody that can legally write a prescription. It
So it
can't be
cannot.
anybody else.
Okay, what if your tenant, the property is here in Arizona, the tenant is from a different state, and the letter they have is from another state, not from Arizona?
They have to get a letter from Arizona. They have to get a letter from an Arizona doctor that can write the prescription. Unless if it's from an MD where they're from, then there's not worth arguing about. But if it's from, for example, if they're from California, and I'll just pick on the one I saw the other day. One I saw the other day was from a massage therapist. That's why I mentioned that. That's not legal in Arizona. And my answer to them was your prescription's not legal in Arizona. If it's a true comfort animal, you have to get a prescription from somebody in Arizona. In California,
Oh.
psychiatrists and psychologists can write prescriptions.
Mm-hmm.
In Arizona, that's not true.
Okay, so,
Psychiatrists can, a psychologist can't.
okay, so I can go to the tenant and request the prescription be from a true MD or a DO in order for it to be valid.
You can verify the prescription and you can tell the tenant whether it's valid or not, yes.
Oh, okay.
The reason we're saying that is there's these services out there, which is what you might be running into.
Yep.
There's these services out there that have these comfort animals that you can get on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Those specifically are not valid. They've been called out as not being valid. But if the person that wrote their prescription wherever they're at was a valid person that can write a prescription, both here or there, then you have to take it. If it's somebody that can't write a valid prescription here, so it's not an MD or a psychiatrist or one of the other people that can write a prescription here, you can legitimately require them to go get a legal prescription in the state of Arizona.
Okay.
And
Okay.
if it's from the internet, it's not valid anywhere. Internet animal certificates are not valid in any way, shape, or form anymore. And
Yeah,
that's
because
not
I
just
did-
in Arizona, that's everywhere now.
Right, because I did look when I first got the tenant, and it was a psychologist in New Mexico, but it was one of those services that you pay to get the letter. It wasn't like a patient, like an ongoing therapy type of
Right, since
situation.
2016, we've been able to turn those down.
Okay.
Before 2016, we had to just bite the bullet and take it.
Okay. Okay. The other question I have is, when you were saying security deposits requiring them from some tenants and not others, what do you exactly mean by that?
You have to require a security deposit from all tenants, and it has to be the same idea from all tenants.
Oh, okay.
You can't require a security deposit from one tenant and not another tenant. You can't charge one tenant an extra fee because you don't like the way Todd wears his hat. If it was a cowboy hat, it would be fine, but it's a backwards baseball cap. We don't like those. So it's going to
Oh,
cost Todd an extra $100. Can't do that.
okay.
That's discriminatory. Even though
Okay.
Todd is the only class that can be discriminated against legally.
Okay. Got it. And then the other question I have, I'm sorry, I'm taking up all
You're
this
fine.
time.
Go ahead.
When you were talking about the pools, the pool being green and that, you as the landlord getting fined because you're creating a bad environment for the community because it's green.
Yep.
How would they find that out that it's green?
They have those helicopters that fly around. You'd be surprised how many pictures of green pools they take.
Okay.
And they
So,
start
okay.
looking, they look generally 3 times a year. They start looking when it starts getting hot. So sometime in April and May, when the police helicopter's flying around, it's snapping pictures of everybody's backyard. And then they look again after the first or second heavy monsoon storm comes through, because that's again when they turn green. And then they'll look in the middle of winter because people quit running their pools in the middle of winter. And before anybody asks, if the tenant's responsible for upkeep of the pool, why aren't they responsible when it turns green? Because as the judge once told me, the tenant has no money, you do.
Oh, okay. So it's basically, and you cannot go back and then when you're evicting the tenant, you cannot go back and say, well, part of the charges of eviction too is going to be because you had to
Oh, God, yes,
fix
you
your pool.
can. I did.
Oh, you can?
As
Oh,
a matter of fact, I
okay.
used the court's decision, same court, same judge, different day. I used his decision in the prior case on the green pool to justify why the tenant had to be evicted for not living up to the terms of his lease. And the fact that I got
Oh,
fined created a hazardous situation and we needed to evict them. Judge still gave them 30 days to move out, but they still evicted them.
okay.
And then I charged their security deposit for those fees.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Hey, so I have a question, Chris. Because you're saying lease, so does lease, including lease option, because it's two different deals, you have the option is a deal, but you're still under a rental lease, right?
That's
So
correct.
everything that we just talked about, it has to be applicable because it's a lease. And so the rental, everything we just talked about being a renter or a landlord has to be covered because it's a lease.
That's correct.
Okay.
They're a tenant, then you have a tenant-landlord relationship until they exercise their right to purchase the house. When they
Right.
exercise that option, then they're a home buyer once they complete it. It's like the option becomes the purchase contract basically at that point.
Okay.
So yes.
Actually, I have one more question.
Go ahead, Gloria.
When you were talking about the lead-based paint, and you have to disclose that, do you have to disclose that even though the property has been renovated, it's been painted over and everything?
Doesn't matter. If the property's of age to have lead-based paint, you must disclose everything you know about lead-based paint. There's a form for that. You must
Okay.
also tell the tenant where they can get or give them the form on the document on lead-based paint, dealing with houses with lead-based paint. And
Okay.
the solution clearly is to paint over all of it, right?
Right.
So I understand the force of your question, but again, legally, as far as the legal side goes, it doesn't matter. You have to disclose that the house is of the time when there might be lead-based paint. And generally what you do is you tell them you don't know anything about it. You don't have any documentation on it.
Mhm.
And then tell them where they can get the document on lead-based paint. And the document can be gotten from 2 different places. It can be gotten from the Department of Real Estate, actually 3 different places. It can be gotten from AAR, Arizona Association of Realtors. Be gotten from the Department of Real Estate. It can also be gotten from the Secretary of State's office.
Oh, but I don't have to give it to them when they sign the lease. I don't have
No,
to give
you-
it to them
You don't have to give it to them, but you have to tell them where they can get it.
where I can find it.
By the
Okay.
way, you probably at the same time, it's not 100% requirement unless they're Section 8 or under one of the housing services, but you probably ought to get used to telling them where they can find the Landlord Tenant Act too. Secretary
that
of
I did.
State.
Yes, that I did do.
Same thing.
Okay, so just add it in there. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Anything else?
Good stuff.
What do you want to talk about next week?
You had said something about getting a lender, Chris.
Yeah, I can have a lender come in and talk to us about what's going on with lending and some of the new requirements that we're being hit with.
I think that'd be awesome.
All right, I'll have Patrick Rapps from Cherry Creek Mortgage come and talk with us.
Sweet.
All right.
Chris, this was wonderful.
Put
This
the
was
video on.
really great.
Well, I'm glad you're enjoying it. We're getting more people to show up, so we must be doing something right.
This is a huge amount of value added.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chris, I have 6 pages of notes I've been taking while you've been talking.
Sound like my husband.
This is like a college education, Chris.
Oh, it is.
You know, we got it recorded. I'll have to start uploading them again to the Facebook page.
No, this
And
was
it-
great. This was
and-
really, really good. A lot of substance. Thank you.
You're
But
welcome.
it's also in the education. Chris teaches this. This is where I learned this stuff 8 years ago.
This is where I met Gloria was talking about one of these courses when, as Ben says, they gave me a diet soda and I wouldn't shut up for the next 9 hours.
Mhm.
Gosh, what will you do for a scotch?
Ben kept making a big deal out of that. Don't give him a diet soda. Don't give him a diet soda. He doesn't shut up once you do.
Maybe the scotch is an antidote. Is that it, Chris?
No, that's later at night. That might actually encourage me to hurry up and finish so I can go have the scotch.
Well, anyways, very good stuff. We, as always, thank you. And then next week we'll talk about lending, and I think that'll be a huge value add. I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right,
you so much,
everybody.
Chris.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Chris. Good night,
Have a
everybody.
good night.
Thanks,
Good night, Chris.
Chris.
Thanks so
Thank you.
much. Chris.
Good night.